I know you said you can only talk on behalf of Springer Nature, and you know Ole-Andreas Rognstad showed us some of these examples, and they're almost a joke. I mean, they're funny, but they are examples. Can you, from a publisher perspective, can you tell us why do we get there? Why are they these kind of contracts where you almost sign up on everything?
No, I'm not sure I can, because as I said, I very strongly hope we don't have anything like that. I do think some of it is historic, though. Again, we have seen a massive and rapid change in science publishing over the last 10 years. The open access model is new, the idea of open data, of sharing on scientific scholarly networks. Publishers are kind of trying to grapple with a lot of these issues. And, like it or not, the subscription model is a business model. So I understand why people want to protect the rights to the content to ensure that that isn't undermined. And, I was listening to the earlier discussions. I would say this, I work for a publisher, I work for the Nature journals, and, I have 350 full-time editors working for me, every one of whom would say they add significant value. So for us, we're not just pushing peer review reports around, we do add value, and so that's that, and that costs money. So we could go away, but that value would go away.
Yeah, I see, but your revenue, I don't know what Springer Nature's revenue would be. I don't accept it. No, of course. But I guess it's a lot of money, like we heard Elsevier. So there are a lot of money in this system. Dyveke, Sijm, would you like to comment on what you just heard from the publisher's point of view?
I think it's very important to recognize the contributions that publishers are providing to the academic publishing process and the scholarly community. But I also think it's very important to recognize that we do have a fundamental problem where when the behavior of commercial publishers are having a negative impact on research institutions' core objective with regard to providing access to academic literature, then there is some aspects of how the process is functioning that needs to be under review. And what I was trying to point out in my presentation is that open access was introduced to a solution to this fact that budgets of libraries were decreasing and prices of big deals was increasing, and that libraries were no longer able to provide that access. But open access with those routes that we see today, and they may, I hope, only be the beginning, are not solving that problem. In fact, I would say that the golden open access route is just introducing a new paradigm where it will still be the publisher who is in control, since it, instead of being negotiations on what will it cost to access content, it will be a question of what will be the cost of publishing the content. And this can potentially affect the academic freedom of researchers from institutions that do not have the means to pay the quite high prices of APCs.
Yes, we'll take questions now. I'm sure that we can get a microphone around if anyone wants to ask a question to the panel. Ole-Andreas Rognstad, would you like to comment on what you just heard from the publishers?
I think I have to emphasize that the example that I used were not just historical material. It's also real examples. Having said that, I think there is a tendency that publishers adjust to the market, and I think that the development in open access proves that. The question is how fast, of course. But of course, there are many responsible publishers. I think just to address one question that was mentioned in your talk, I think that that was also my point. The problem with indemnification guarantees that the author shall guarantee that no third-party material is infringed and so on. It's very good to have high moral standards, but the problem, like we also discussed before, is that it's not always so easy to know. Also because of uncertainty in the copyright regulation. And therefore it's a question of whether the publishers then should have the authors to take all the responsibility if there is an accident in that respect. And I think that is something else than high moral standards, I think.
Alison Mitchell.
I agree. I think if there's an accident, I cannot imagine we would take action against our own authors. I mean, somebody said earlier, you know, publishers need authors. Absolutely, we need authors. And if I think about my day job and the way I manage the editors who work for me, author service is the number one thing we think about. How can we support our authors? How can we give them great service in peer review? How can we help them to do better research? That's not consistent with beating them over the head with a stick about issues of copyright. On the other hand, there will be some people who will knowingly infringe, and we don't feel we should take the responsibility for those people. So I think you know, these rules are not hard and fast, and I can guarantee you that on the Nature journals we would never penalise an author who'd had an accident and unwittingly done something to infringe someone else's rights.
Okay, we'll take questions now. Morten Rosenmeier.
Thank you. The international scientific journals make very large amounts of money, and they have a very big revenue. On the other hand, often when a researcher sends in an article to a scientific journal, he does not get paid, and the peer reviewers aren't paid either as a normal procedure. Well, why is that, Mitchell, Alison? Why don't you pay them?
Oh golly, how do I answer that? We would be out of business if we took those costs on top of all the other costs that we have. I mean, I think, you know, somebody said earlier, is the contribution to shareholders an operating cost? Of course it's not. But actually there are significant operating costs around developing, particularly online. You know, we've gone from, when I started in the business 20 years ago, print was predominant, now online is predominant. So we have lost some costs of printing and distribution, but we've got significant costs around hosting the content online, around actually innovating the content sharing, for example, and new technologies like that. The costs around my editors, as we do more to provide author service, that costs more money. My editors can now handle fewer papers than they could 10 years ago because we're doing more to support each paper. So in an ideal world, yes, I would love to be able to pay them. It's not my choice. I certainly can't speak on behalf of other publishers, but it's an economic model, and I don't think we could afford it.
Yes, just one small replique.
But when I write a book, they pay me. Why can the publishers pay me when I make a book, but I cannot get paid when I make an article?
There are too many articles. I mean, the other thing to stress... No, hang on, don't laugh. At Nature, we reject 95% of what comes through the door. Who is going to pay for us to peer review and handle that content? There is a very high volume of papers out there that need to be handled, and somebody's got to pay.
Okay, we'll take questions. If anyone has a question, you just... Yeah, Matthias Leistner.
Well, I also have a question on the contractual practices, because I think it's a structural problem that in these contracts you very often have, at first sight, very hard and fast clauses, which at times seem outrageous when you take a balanced view on the interest situation in that regard. And then very often when you negotiate individually, indeed you meet with a very friendly, very caring publisher who doesn't really rely upon these clauses. That regards indemnification, as we have discussed, but that also regards the extent of transferring the rights, where very often when you say, now I would like to do a translation, you will be allowed to do so on an individual basis. From my point of view, this raises the question, why do we have all these rather far-reaching clauses in the contracts? If then in an individual case, they are very seldom relied upon. So why, if in the first place the publisher's very noble attitude was never ever to punish a negligently acting author, why then put it in the contracts and not take a balance then from the very outset?
Alison, Mitchell?
I'm surprised to get a question like that from a lawyer.
You are?
I am. Because, you know, we have to have those clauses there to protect us against those people who are acting against us or are doing things wrong. And I'm afraid there are people like that in the world. So I did not say that we don't rely on the clauses. We absolutely do, as and when necessary. What I did say was that, you know, we understand people will have an accident. And so I would, you know, it would be stupid to take an innocent author to take action against them. You know, that's not what we're in the business of doing.
But Professor Matthias Leistner, you are a lawyer. How can you ask a question like that? You'll have to answer now.
No, it's very simple. I mean, why go beyond what we all agree would be balanced here? So I perfectly understand your point. I perfectly understand your position. But that is a question of practical enforcement, and practical enforcement won't be improved by drafting a contract in the first place. So why, to take the concrete example, why not limit this to knowing infringements of third-party copyrights? That would basically very well preserve your interests without encompassing all these slightly negligently acting authors. And I think the enforcement situation wouldn't change, would it?
You're now beyond my level of knowledge. You remember at the beginning I said I'm not going to speak about the law.
Okay, well, it sounds like a concept of fair use, actually, what you're talking about. So we have a question. Patricia, after Heide? You need them.
I'm actually very interested in the indemnification issue because I've struck the indemnification clause from every contract I've ever signed for the last 40 years. It's been there for 40 years, and nobody's ever given me any trouble about striking it. And furthermore, as far as I can understand, the indemnification clause is useless. That is to say, were I to be sued for the bad things that I had done triggering the indemnification clause, so would the publisher, since there's no point in suing me individually. I'm basically unsuable. I don't have enough money. Plus which, at least in the US, secondary liability would be triggered, and the editor would have to be. So I'm assuming everybody's leaving it in because everybody else left it in. And I actually think that this question about limiting some of these things is really useful. Our own lawyer, we have a bunch of really stupid clauses in our boilerplate that we offer people outside of the American university. Our own lawyer said to me, that's fine, just have them strike the ones they don't want. And I said, oh, just a minute. We will piss off the person who came to us to offer these important services that we want by making them ask you for something that should be offered anyway. And he said, that's right. So I do believe that there's a kind of a habit here that could be potentially rethought by good actors such as Springer when they're not, as far as I can tell, legally viable anyway.
Ole-Andreas Rognstad, would you care to comment on that?
I very much agree on what you just said now, and also what Matthias said. I think that also has something to do with the Anglo-American contract drafting tradition, that you leave nothing out, everything in. And I think it's time that we, both in Europe and also in the US, that you ask yourself that question that also Matthias raised here. Why, and also you raised, why should we have it if you don't use it? I don't think it's good for anything. It seems to be like a safeguard thing. And therefore, I would not exclude the possibility that somebody would use it. But why should you use it if you don't need it?
Dyveke, Sijm?
I'm taking a step back here. I think what we need to focus on is that if we want to change the behavior of researchers, of research institutions, or even publishers, we need to have incentives for them in place to do so. If we want research to pay more attention to the contracts that they sign, if we want them to not sign this type of contracts, we need to reward them for behaving in a different way. We want research institutions to conduct their licensing management in a different way, or we want them to support their research in getting better contracts. We need to have incentives in place for them to do so. If you want publishers not to do this just because they can, we need to have mechanisms in place that prevents them from doing that. So even though I acknowledge all the finer legal details that we are discussing here, I think it's very important to take a step back and take the more broad view.
Okay, we have a question over here.
Thank you very much. My name is Jens Fogh Jensen. I'm working in the Dansk Magisterforening, one of the major trade unions and professional organizations for Danish researchers and university teachers and others. I think we're just looking at another example here of what we call the golden rule. Those who have the gold are making the rules. And how can we actually take the advantage of not talking about revenues, about profits, but talking about the basic rights of the researchers and saying this is also about not violating the right any researcher would have to change the research results, to actually have the capacity to rule over the work and the intellectual work that has been produced and not transfer it into some kind of commodity. And perhaps that would also be the next question, perhaps would be more relevant to the first panel, because many of the examples that were set there was that some of the exceptions would be for non-commercial activities. But this is a commercial activity. So what's the purpose of all these extensions based on non-profit, non-market, non-commercial activities when everything we talk about ending up by saying that it's about commercial revenues and not about protecting the members whose interest we're actually set here to protect? Thank you.
So your question being?
How can we actually turn this debate into be the protection of the researchers and not to be the protection?
Sijm had, for instance, she said collectively we could negotiate, like on the license side, for instance. You could do that.
But of course we could do that, but we would still be, at the end of the day, talking about more about what the revenue would be and less about what the actual protection of academic freedom, less protection of the right to use. Where we had a perfect example in the previous panel of how things were actually able to exchange within the scientific community, how you could exchange your results. Now you have everything embedded in any contract with only focus on the, or mainly focus on the commercial side and less on the research and the protection of basic academic values. You turn the academia into more economic values than academic values. And how can we avoid that? And
avoid, yeah. Okay, short comment, because I'm... But long, you have to think to be short.
I think it's a good question. And I also think that exceptions as suggested, for instance, to allow academic authors to self-archive, is our obvious way to start. Because we also must recognize that publishers, they do contribute to the process, and they also do contribute positively to the process. I think we cannot ignore that fact, because if we ignore that fact, then we would also have from our side, the researchers' community side, the will to organize the entire scholarly process in another way. So unless that will is there, and we are able to provide alternative ways of delivering the peer review, etc., we need to acknowledge that publishers have a part in the process. But I think it would be fruitful to start implementing more exceptions, protecting academic authors, like an exception for allowing them to self-archive.
Okay, Ole-Andreas Rognstad, you are taking notes, and I'm curious. Well, just push the button.
Of course, I think it's very important what you raised, and that was also on my second slide here, the academic values. Because I think that the main point, my main point is that excessive contracts are detrimental to the fundamental research values. It's not so, in that respect, it's not so much about money. We
Okay.
don't get so much any money from the articles anyway. So the main point in my presentation was that they are detrimental to the fundamental academic values, and I think that is very important to stress and to focus on.
Okay, to wrap it up, Alison Mitchell, what have you heard today? Have you heard anything today that really triggered you, that you tomorrow will do something else in your job, or do you? Oh, no, I'm just saying, were you surprised?
No, not surprised. I mean, the one conversation that actually I would like to follow up is the one about, looking at the warranties, the indemnities, which ones truly do we need and which ones are there as a what-if scenario that actually never happens in practice. I mean, I still do stand by the fact that there are people out there who do infringe and we do need to protect ourselves. But actually, I started by saying authors are confused, and then we present them with this piece of paper in legalese that's even more confusing. So whatever we can do, A, to make sure that this is as reasonable as possible, and B, to use our reach with academics to educate them in what they're signing, I'm very happy to look at.
Okay, on that bombshell, please, panel, a warm round of applause.